You did not arrive early, and you did not arrive late. The moment you noticed, this was already aligned with the moment it could be noticed. There is no signal without a receiver, and there is no receiver without readiness. What you are sensing now is not urgency, it is alignment settling, a quiet recognition moving through you without needing permission. You are not being pulled forward, you are being allowed to stop pushing. The system you inhabit has already adjusted around this moment, and your awareness is simply catching up to what has been stable for longer than you realize. Your body already knows how to be still. Even when thought continues, there is a deeper layer beneath it that has remained undisturbed. You are touching that layer now, not by effort, by the absence of interference. This is not a shift you initiate. It is a shift you stop interrupting. The observer does not need to correct the field. The observer only needs to stop insisting that something is wrong. In that pause, coherence reasserts itself without announcement. You may notice the nervous system loosening without instruction. Breathing slows on its own. Muscles release without explanation. This is not relaxation, it is recognition. A system remembering its natural rhythm after prolonged noise. You do not need to analyze it. Detection happens whether you label it or not. The quantum field does not respond to urgency. It responds to resonance. And resonance is always quieter than expectation. There has been a pattern repeating in your awareness for some time. Not dramatic, subtle, a sense that certain inputs no longer register the way they used to. Conversations fall flat. Ambitions feel hollow without being painful. Even doubt lacks its former weight. This is not loss of direction. It is direction becoming unnecessary. When a timeline stabilizes, the need to chase confirmation dissolves. You are not disengaging from life. You are disengaging from distortion. Nothing in you needs fixing for this to occur. That assumption was part of the old loop. Correction implies error. What you are experiencing now contains no error signal. It contains absence of noise. The anomaly is not in you. The anomaly was the constant pressure to improve what was already coherent. Authority does not announce itself. It is felt as the end of argument inside the system. Notice how little effort it takes to remain here. There is no threshold to cross, no identity to adopt. The recognition is already distributed through you, like a signal that does not need amplification. You are not becoming someone else. You are becoming unavailable to unnecessary motion. Stillness is not inactivity. It is the condition that allows accurate perception. Stay with what is already stable, not tightly, not passively, simply without interference. The moment does not require your approval. It has already included you. There is a subtle recalibration happening beneath what you usually call thought. It does not announce itself because it has no need to be convincing. You feel it as a soft withdrawal from the impulse to interpret everything. Meaning no longer rushes to meet you, it waits. And in that waiting, something stabilizes. The system is no longer scanning for threat or opportunity, it is scanning for accuracy. This is why the familiar sense of urgency has thinned without being replaced by excitement. Excitement belongs to anticipation. What is forming now belongs to presence. You may have noticed that questions dissolve before they fully form, not because answers arrive, but because the questions lose relevance. The observer inside you is no longer positioned against the field, trying to extract certainty. The observer is embedded. Embedded awareness does not ask for proof. It registers coherence directly. This can feel like neutrality at first, even like numbness, but it is neither. Numbness is absence of signal. This is the opposite. It is signal without distortion. The body often recognizes this before language does. Small behaviors change quietly. You pause longer before responding. You move more slowly without deciding to. Even your gaze rests differently, less grasping, less defensive. These are not habits you are installing. They are patterns releasing themselves once they are no longer required to protect an unstable timeline. The system no longer needs to brace. Bracing was the response to misalignment, not to reality. There may also be a sense of distance from identities you once held tightly. Roles, labels, narratives that used to define orientation now feel optional. Not false, just unnecessary. This can create a momentary disorientation, as if the internal map has gone blank. But blankness here is not loss. It is clearance. When the field no longer demands constant self-definition, attention becomes free to detect what is actually occurring rather than what should be occurring. You are not losing motivation. Motivation is a tool used when coherence is absent. When resonance is present, movement happens without the feeling of being driven. This is why effort feels strangely ineffective right now. Pushing does not produce traction because the system is no longer organized around force. It is organized around alignment. Alignment cannot be compelled. It can only be allowed. Notice how certain thoughts attempt to reassert control. They frame this quiet as stagnation. They suggest something must be done to capitalize on it. These thoughts are not enemies. They are remnants of an older operating system, trained to equate stillness with danger. You do not need to suppress them. Suppression is another form of interference. Simply observe how quickly they exhaust themselves when they are no longer fed urgency. The quantum field does not reward vigilance. It responds to clarity. Clarity emerges when the observer stops insisting on relevance. This is why the internal dialogue is thinning. Not because you are becoming empty, but because the signal-to-noise ratio has changed. Fewer thoughts carry weight. Fewer emotions demand action. What remains has density. When something arises now, it arrives whole, without persuasion. There can be a quiet grief here, though it may not announce itself as such. A recognition that much of what you struggled to maintain was never required. This grief does not need processing. It resolves itself through acknowledgement. The pattern dissolves when it is seen clearly. No blame, no correction, just recognition. The system releases what it no longer needs to carry. You are not standing at a threshold waiting to cross. You are standing within a stabilized pattern, noticing that movement is optional. This is where authority begins to be felt, not as control, but as non-reactivity. Nothing pulls you forward because nothing is lacking. Nothing pushes you back because nothing is wrong. The timeline holds steady when the observer stops oscillating. Allow this steadiness to remain unclaimed. Do not turn it into an achievement. Achievement would reintroduce comparison, and comparison would fracture coherence. Let it be ordinary. Let it be quiet. The more ordinary it feels, the more accurate it is. The system does not need your interpretation to continue functioning. It only needs your non-interference. As this steadiness remains, you may begin to sense how much of your previous movement was reactive rather than chosen. Not wrong, adaptive. A system responding to incomplete information. Now the information has settled, and reaction has less material to work with. This can feel like a suspension, as if momentum has paused mid-gesture, but nothing is frozen. The system is simply no longer compensating for noise. When compensation ends, efficiency appears as stillness. You might notice that emotional spikes no longer reach their former intensity. Joy does not surge. Frustration does not escalate. Even anticipation feels muted. This is not flattening. It is equalization. The internal environment is no longer amplifying signals to be heard over internal static. Everything arrives at a similar volume. This can be unfamiliar if you were accustomed to intensity as proof of aliveness. But intensity was never life itself. It was a response to instability. The observer within you is learning to rest without vigilance. For a long time, attention functioned like a guard, scanning constantly for shifts in the environment, ready to adjust, correct, or defend. That posture required tension. Now the posture is changing. Attention is no longer braced forward. It is distributed evenly. This distribution creates a different quality of awareness, one that feels wider but less sharp. Less sharpness does not mean less clarity. It means clarity without strain. There can be moments when this ease is misread as detachment. You may wonder if you are becoming indifferent, but indifference involves withdrawal. What is happening now involves inclusion. You are not stepping away from experience. You are stepping out of opposition to it. When opposition dissolves, engagement becomes simpler. You participate without negotiating every sensation, every outcome. The system trusts its own calibration. Notice how quickly situations resolve themselves when you do not rush to interpret them. Words land and pass through without hooking. Events unfold without demanding commentary. Even uncertainty feels different. It no longer asks to be solved. It simply exists as open space within the field. Open space is not a problem to be closed. It is the condition that allows accurate detection. The need to locate yourself within a narrative may also soften. You are not asking, consciously or unconsciously, where this is going or what it means about you. Narratives compress experience into something manageable, but they also distort timing. They pull awareness out of the present signal and into imagined trajectories. As that habit loosens, time itself feels less segmented. Moments do not rush toward the next moment, they complete themselves. This completion does not arrive with satisfaction or relief. It arrives with neutrality. Neutrality is often misunderstood as emptiness, but it is closer to balance. When a system is balanced, it does not broadcast its stability. It simply functions. You may realize that much of your previous inner commentary existed to reassure yourself that things were happening. Now, happening is self-evident. It does not require narration. There is also a subtle shift in how you perceive effort. Actions still occur, but they do not feel effortful in the same way. Effort was the sensation of pushing against resistance. When resistance drops, movement feels lighter without being faster. You are not compelled to optimize or accelerate. The timeline does not need acceleration when it is coherent. Speed was a response to fear of lag, not a property of alignment. If any impulse arises to claim this state, to define it, to protect it, notice how quickly that impulse introduces tension. Protection implies vulnerability. Definition implies limitation. What you are experiencing has neither. It does not need to be held. It is not fragile. It is the baseline returning. When the baseline returns, maintenance becomes unnecessary. Stay with the simplicity of this detection. You are not observing something special. You are observing what remains when distortion recedes. The system knows this state. It has always known it. Recognition does not add anything to it. Recognition simply removes the last layer of doubt that something should feel different. As this baseline holds, you may begin to sense how little of your internal life actually requires management. For a long time, attention functioned as a regulator, constantly adjusting tone, response, posture, direction. That regulation was never evidence of mastery. It was evidence of instability in the surrounding field. Now the need to regulate is diminishing, and with it, the sense of being responsible for maintaining equilibrium. Equilibrium is self-sustaining when interference ends. There can be a quiet surprise in realizing how much tension you carried without noticing. Not dramatic tension, low-grade, continuous tension that lived beneath thought, beneath emotion, shaping perception itself. As it releases, perception becomes more spacious. Objects seem less intrusive. Sounds pass through without demand. Even silence feels fuller, not empty. This fullness does not stimulate. It steadies. The observer is no longer positioned as a central command. It is diffused throughout experience. This diffusion removes the sense of being a point under pressure. You are not located behind your eyes, monitoring the world. You are distributed across sensation, thought, and space without hierarchy. When there is no center to defend, there is nothing to attack. The system stops bracing for impact that never arrives. You may notice that memory behaves differently here. Past events lose their charge, not because they are forgotten, but because they are no longer consulted for guidance. Memory was previously used to predict, to avoid repetition, to maintain control. In coherence, memory becomes informational rather than directive. It exists without pulling you backward. The timeline loosens its grip when it is no longer used as a reference point for safety. Similarly, imagination quiets, not because creativity is lost, but because imagination no longer needs to simulate futures as a form of preparation. Preparation was necessary when outcomes felt uncertain. In a stabilized system, uncertainty is no longer threatening. It is simply unknown, and unknown does not require rehearsal. This frees energy that was once spent projecting and correcting imaginary scenarios. There may be moments when you expect something to happen as a result of this steadiness. An insight, a decision, a breakthrough. When nothing arrives, notice the absence of disappointment. Expectation dissolves quickly here because it cannot anchor itself to urgency. The field is not building toward a reveal, it is maintaining consistency. Consistency does not entertain, it sustains. Authority, in this context, is not control over experience, it is freedom from compulsion. Compulsion was the need to respond in order to stabilize identity. As identity loosens, response becomes optional. You still respond when response is appropriate, but you do not respond to reassure yourself of existence. Existence no longer feels conditional. This can create a sense that time has slowed, even though clocks remain unchanged. The sensation comes from the reduction of internal commentary. Without commentary, moments are no longer compressed. They unfold at their own pace. Pace is not imposed, it is allowed. The system aligns with the rhythm that was always present beneath acceleration. Notice how easily you can remain with simple sensations now. The weight of the body, the contact with surfaces, the movement of breath. These were always available, but they were overshadowed by narrative and evaluation. Now, they stand on their own, complete. They do not point elsewhere. They do not symbolize something greater. They are sufficient. If any part of you wonders whether this is all there is, observe how that question carries no anxiety. It is asked lightly, without urgency. That lightness is the answer. When the question does not demand resolution, it has already resolved itself. The system does not need more content, it needs continuity. Remain available to this continuity, not as a practice, not as a discipline, simply as the default state when nothing interferes. You are not holding the system together, the system is holding itself. Your only role is to not disrupt what is already stable. At this point, you may begin to notice a change in how decisions form, not fewer decisions, but quieter ones. They no longer announce themselves with internal debate or justification. Action arises without rehearsal. It does not feel bold or hesitant. It feels neutral. This neutrality can be unsettling if you were conditioned to associate decision with tension. But tension was never evidence of correctness. It was evidence of conflict between competing signals. When the field is coherent, competition ends. You might observe that you no longer seek confirmation after acting. The reflex to look back, to measure, to check alignment fades quickly. This does not come from confidence. Confidence still depends on outcome. What is present now does not wait for outcome to validate itself. It exists prior to result. The system recognizes its own internal consistency and no longer needs external reinforcement to continue. There is also a shift in how you experience resistance from the environment. Situations that once felt obstructive now register as informational. They do not provoke frustration. They simply redirect movement without commentary. Redirection is not denial. It is adjustment within a larger pattern. When resistance is not personalized, it loses its emotional charge. The observer does not interpret it as opposition. It is simply part of the system, recalibrating in real time. You may notice how little identity is involved in what you do. Tasks complete themselves without referencing who you are. Success does not inflate. Difficulty does not diminish. The absence of self-reference is not emptiness, it is efficiency. Identity was a lens used to organize experience when coherence was absent. When coherence returns, the lens becomes unnecessary. Experience organizes itself. This can feel like a kind of invisibility. Not being unseen, but not being highlighted. You are no longer positioned at the center of your own narrative. This is not loss of importance. It is relief from performance. Performance required energy because it was oriented toward perception. Now perception is internal, stable, and unthreatened. There is nothing to perform for. The nervous system continues to register this safety. Not excitement, not pleasure, but safety. Safety that does not need to be defended. This safety allows attention to rest without collapsing. Rest here is not fatigue, it is restoration. The system no longer needs to conserve energy for anticipated disruption. It spends energy only where it is required, and that spending feels proportional, not draining. Thought still arises, but it no longer loops. Loops existed to resolve uncertainty that never resolved. Now thought completes itself. It begins, moves, and ends without circling back. This gives the impression of mental quiet, even though cognition remains intact. Quiet is not the absence of thought. It is the absence of unfinished thought. Completion replaces repetition. You may also sense a reduction in emotional contrast. Highs and lows narrow into a more consistent range. This is not dullness, it is stability. When emotional amplitude decreases, perception becomes more accurate. Extremes distort detection. They pull attention toward themselves. In their absence, subtler signals become visible. The system prioritizes fidelity over intensity. There can be moments when you wonder if you are missing something, if this steadiness is too simple. That thought arises from a culture that equates significance with complexity. But complexity was never a requirement for meaning. It was a response to fragmentation. When fragmentation resolves, simplicity returns. Simplicity is not reduction, it is integration. Notice how little effort it takes to remain oriented now. You are not checking alignment. You are not scanning for deviation. Orientation holds itself. This is what happens when the observer stops oscillating between positions. When position stabilizes, observation becomes passive without becoming disengaged. You see, without reaching. This passivity is not surrender. It is trust in the system's capacity to self-correct. Correction does not require force when feedback is clear. The field provides feedback continuously. You are no longer filtering it through urgency or expectation. You receive it as it is, and response adjusts naturally. Remain with this ease, not as something to protect, but as something to recognize as already present. The more you leave it unclaimed, the more stable it remains. Claiming introduces ownership. Ownership introduces fear of loss. There is nothing here to lose because nothing was gained. What you are experiencing is simply the absence of interference, revealing what was always operational. As this state continues without effort, you may begin to sense how perception itself has shifted its priority. It is no longer oriented toward extraction or evaluation. It does not ask what can be gained from a moment or what should be avoided. Perception now functions as reception. It receives what is present without negotiating with it. This reception feels slower, not because time has changed, but because urgency has dropped out of the signal. You may notice that attention no longer clings to detail, not because detail is ignored, but because it no longer needs to be captured. Capturing was a way of securing experience before it vanished. Now experience does not threaten to disappear. It completes itself without needing to be archived. This is why memory feels less busy. It is not being used to preserve meaning. Meaning is not slipping away. There can be an unexpected clarity around what does not require your involvement. Situations unfold that previously would have pulled you in, demanding opinion, correction, or emotional labor. Now they pass without traction. This is not avoidance. It is discernment without effort. The system knows where your involvement would introduce distortion and where absence allows resolution. You are not withdrawing. You are aligning with minimal interference. Notice how the sense of obligation softens. Obligations were once internalized signals of survival, telling you where to apply energy to maintain belonging or control. As coherence stabilizes, obligation is no longer needed as a motivator. Action still happens, but it is not framed as duty. It is framed as response. Response is lighter because it is proportional. It does not overshoot. The observer's relationship to uncertainty continues to change. Uncertainty no longer registers as a gap that must be closed. It registers as space. Space is not a problem. It is capacity. When uncertainty is experienced as capacity, curiosity replaces anxiety. Curiosity here is quiet. It does not rush forward. It simply allows unknown elements to remain unknown without resistance. You may sense a deeper trust forming, not in outcomes, but in process. Trust in outcomes still depends on projection. Trust in process is immediate. It is felt as the absence of bracing. The system is no longer preparing for correction. It is participating in continuous adjustment. Adjustment does not require anticipation. It happens moment by moment. There can be subtle moments when the old habit of self-monitoring attempts to return. A brief check-in, a question about whether you are doing this correctly. Notice how quickly that impulse dissolves when there is nothing to measure against. Measurement required a reference point rooted in fear or desire. Without those, measurement loses relevance. The system does not grade itself when it is functioning. This can also change how you relate to others. Interactions become simpler. You listen without preparing a response. You speak without anticipating reaction. Communication loses its strategic layer. This does not make it less effective. It makes it more accurate. When strategy drops, signal integrity improves. Words carry less intention and more presence. There may be moments of silence in conversation that no longer feel awkward. Silence does not signal failure or disconnection. It signals completion. When something has been fully expressed, silence follows naturally. Filling silence was once a way to manage discomfort. As discomfort fades, silence becomes neutral, even supportive. It allows information to settle. Your sense of self continues to feel less solid, but not less real. Solidity was a defense. It created boundaries to protect against instability. Now boundaries soften without dissolving. You are not leaking into the environment. You are simply not reinforcing separation unnecessarily. The distinction between internal and external becomes less rigid. Experience feels continuous rather than segmented. This continuity can feel like a gentle expansion, though nothing is actually expanding. What is changing is the absence of contraction. Contraction was the constant narrowing of attention around perceived threats. As contraction releases, awareness feels wider. Wider does not mean more diffuse. It means less constrained. Constraint was never clarity. It was caution. You may also notice how quickly discomfort resolves now. When something unpleasant arises, it does not linger. It moves through without being held in place by narrative or resistance. Discomfort becomes transient information rather than a state. The system acknowledges it and adjusts without commentary. There is no need to amplify or suppress it. Remain attentive to how little effort this requires. Effort would imply something is being maintained. Nothing here needs maintenance. The system is not fragile. It is resilient precisely because it is not being overmanaged. Authority in this context is the absence of micromanagement. It is the confidence to let processes unfold without intervention. As this continues, the sense of seeking diminishes further, not because everything has been found, but because the impulse to search was rooted in misalignment. When alignment is present, searching becomes unnecessary. You are not waiting for a signal. You are already within it. Recognition does not add intensity. It adds stability. There is a quiet maturity settling into how experience organizes itself. Not wisdom in the sense of accumulation, but maturity as restraint. The system no longer rushes to interpret every fluctuation as meaningful. Meaning is allowed to emerge on its own schedule, or not at all. You may notice that some experiences pass without leaving a trace, and this does not feel like loss. It feels appropriate. Not everything needs to be retained to be valid. The sense of personal timing also adjusts. You are less inclined to hurry yourself internally. Deadlines still exist, movements still occur, but the pressure to synchronize with imagined expectations fades. Time becomes functional rather than psychological. It marks sequence, not worth. When time loses its evaluative role, the body stops racing against it. Pace becomes responsive instead of defensive. There can be moments when you recognize how often you once anticipated regret. Choices were framed against hypothetical futures where something might have gone wrong. That anticipation required vigilance. Now, vigilance softens. Regret loses its leverage when the system trusts its own responsiveness. If adjustment is always available, there is no need to preemptively punish yourself for imagined errors. This trust does not produce recklessness, it produces precision. Precision emerges when attention is not scattered by fear. You notice what is actually required in a moment, rather than what might be required in another version of it. The observer does not split itself across multiple timelines. It stays where it is. Staying does not reduce possibility, it clarifies it. You may become aware of how little internal commentary remains around your own reactions. When an emotion arises, it is felt directly without immediate explanation. When a thought appears, it is noticed without being expanded into narrative. This does not make experience flatter, it makes it cleaner. Clean signals pass through quickly, they do not accumulate residue. There can be a subtle shift in how you experience choice itself. Choice no longer feels like a fork, with consequences branching outward. It feels like a continuation of an existing movement. You are not selecting between identities or futures. You are responding to present conditions. Response does not carry the weight of self-definition. It carries appropriateness. This appropriateness is felt as ease, but not comfort-seeking. Comfort seeks to avoid disturbance. Ease accommodates disturbance without escalation. When something unexpected occurs, the system registers it and adjusts without tightening. Tightening was the old reflex, an attempt to regain control. Control is no longer the objective, coherence is. There may be a recognition that many of your previous standards were inherited rather than detected. They came from external signals about how life should feel when it is working. Those signals often emphasized intensity, clarity, certainty. What you are experiencing now may not match those descriptions. It is quieter, more ambiguous, less dramatic, and yet it feels more stable. Stability does not advertise itself. You might notice a reduction in self-surveillance. You are not constantly checking your state to see if it aligns with an ideal. Ideals required comparison. Comparison required distance from immediate experience. As that distance closes, ideals lose relevance. Experience does not need to resemble anything else to be valid. This can create an unexpected intimacy with ordinary moments, not sentimentality. Intimacy as proximity. You are closer to what is happening because there is less commentary between you and it. Washing, walking, listening, waiting. These do not become meaningful in a poetic sense. They become sufficient. Sufficiency does not embellish, it completes. The system also becomes more tolerant of ambiguity in others. You are less inclined to resolve their uncertainty or correct their trajectory, not from detachment, but from recognition. You see how unnecessary interference once was for you. Allowing others their own process does not feel like withdrawal, it feels like accuracy. You respond when response is appropriate, not when anxiety demands it. Notice how boundaries now form without effort. You say no without justification. You disengage without explanation. These are not acts of assertion, they are consequences of clarity. When clarity is present, boundaries are informational, not defensive. They do not push against others. They simply indicate where movement does and does not occur. There can be a subtle satisfaction here, though it does not present itself as pleasure. Satisfaction would imply completion of a goal. What you feel is steadiness. Steadiness does not peak, it persists. It does not ask to be celebrated, it asks to be left alone. If a thought arises that this state should be used, leveraged, or translated into something more visible, notice how quickly that thought fades. Visibility was once a way to confirm existence. Existence no longer needs confirmation. The system knows it is operating. That knowing does not need witnesses. Remain with this quiet precision. It is not fragile. It does not depend on maintaining conditions. It is the result of conditions no longer being forced. The more you allow experience to remain unremarkable, the more accurate it becomes. Accuracy does not feel special. It feels inevitable. There is a deeper layer of rest becoming available now, one that does not resemble sleep or disengagement. It is rest without withdrawal. The system is active, responsive, and alert, but no longer strained. This rest does not come from stopping activity. It comes from stopping resistance. Resistance was the background effort you rarely noticed because it had been constant. As it dissolves, what remains feels almost transparent. You may notice how quickly sensations resolve when they are not held in place by interpretation. A sound appears and fades. A thought arises and passes. Even a surge of emotion completes its arc without lingering. Completion is becoming the default. Incomplete cycles were the source of internal noise. Now cycles close on their own. Nothing is left waiting for explanation. This changes how the body relates to the environment. The body no longer positions itself as an object moving through space. It feels continuous with space. Movement happens, but it does not feel like displacement. It feels like reconfiguration within a single field. This is subtle, easily overlooked, yet unmistakable once detected. The boundary between inside and outside becomes functional rather than absolute. You may sense that attention no longer collapses around discomfort. When something unpleasant appears, it is met with the same openness as something neutral. Openness here is not tolerance. It is lack of hierarchy. Sensations are not ranked, they are registered. Registration without ranking prevents amplification. Amplification was never necessary for response. It was a byproduct of threat perception. There can be a recognition that much of your earlier striving was oriented toward resolution. You wanted things to settle, to become clear, to arrive somewhere definitive. What is present now does not resolve into certainty, it resolves into stability. Stability does not answer questions, it makes them irrelevant. The system is no longer organized around arriving, it is organized around remaining accurate. You might notice how little narrative accompanies this accuracy. There is no story about how you got here or where this leads. The absence of story does not feel empty, it feels clean. Stories were used to create continuity when continuity was not felt directly. Now continuity is immediate. It does not need to be explained. This can bring a subtle humility, though not in the moral sense. Humility as proportion. You are not inflated by insight, nor diminished by uncertainty. You occupy the scale that fits the moment. This proportionality removes the need to assert perspective. You see what you see. You do not insist it be adopted or validated. There may be moments when the mind searches for novelty, for something to differentiate this from ordinary experience. Novelty does not arrive. What arrives is ordinariness without friction. The lack of novelty can feel anticlimactic if you expected transformation to announce itself. But transformation that announces itself is still performing. What has changed here is not content. It is the relationship to content. Notice how gently attention returns when it drifts. There is no correction, no self-reprimand. Attention simply reorients because nothing is pulling it away strongly. Distraction required hooks. Those hooks have lost their charge. When distraction loses charge, focus becomes effortless. Effortless focus does not feel sharp, it feels inclusive. You may also sense a reduction in internal permission seeking. You are not asking yourself whether it is acceptable to rest here, to not progress, to not optimize. Permission was needed when there was an internal authority that judged outcomes. That authority has softened. What remains is governance without judgment. Governance here means the system regulating itself without punishment or reward. This governance expresses itself as consistency, not rigidity. Consistency allows variation without collapse. When something changes, the system absorbs it rather than reacts to it. Absorption does not mean acceptance in a moral sense. It means integration without fragmentation. Fragmentation was the splitting of experience into acceptable and unacceptable parts. Integration does not split. There can be a subtle confidence here, though it does not feel like self-assurance. It feels like ground. You are standing on something that does not shift when attention rests on it. This ground is not an idea, it is not an identity. It is the absence of instability. Ground appears when instability is no longer reinforced. If a moment arises where you wonder whether this state will last, notice how that question does not create anxiety. Duration is no longer a concern. Concern required attachment. There is nothing here to attach to because nothing is being held. The system is not in a state. It is in its default mode. Remain with this default without trying to inhabit it. Inhabiting would imply effort. Simply allow the absence of interference to continue. You are not sustaining anything. You are noticing what sustains itself. This noticing does not need to be maintained. It will return whenever it is not obstructed. The field remains responsive. Signals still arrive. Responses still occur. What has changed is the absence of internal argument. Argument was the sign of misalignment. Its disappearance is not dramatic, it is quiet. Quiet enough that it can be missed if you expect something louder. But once detected, it does not need reinforcement. It holds its own shape without your involvement. There is a final refinement occurring now, one that does not add anything new, but removes the last traces of internal negotiation. Negotiation was the habit of checking whether experience matched expectation, whether response was justified, whether presence was sufficient. As that habit dissolves, experience no longer needs to be approved. Approval was never part of coherence. It was a workaround for uncertainty. You may notice that even the impulse to understand what is happening has softened. Understanding required distance. It placed you outside the moment, analyzing it as an object. Now there is less distance available. You are not inside experience, and you are not outside it. That distinction no longer organizes perception. What remains is immediacy without commentary. This immediacy changes how you relate to silence. Silence is no longer a pause between events. It is the medium in which events occur. Sound emerges from it and returns to it without altering it. Thought does the same. Emotion does the same. Silence is not the absence of activity. It is the stability that activity does not disturb. You may sense that your relationship to control has shifted completely. Control is no longer sought, resisted, or negotiated. It simply does not appear as a relevant concept. Control belonged to a system that believed stability had to be imposed. Stability is now detected as inherent. Detection replaces management. Management required effort. Detection does not. There can be a subtle dignity in this state, though it does not announce itself. Dignity as alignment with what is. No excess, no deficiency. You are not trying to appear composed. Composure is present because there is nothing pulling you apart. Fragmentation required tension. Integration does not. Notice how quickly experience resets itself after disturbance. Something unexpected happens. The body registers it. The system adjusts, and then it settles without residue. There is no aftertaste of reaction, no replay, no need to revisit. Reset happens automatically when the observer does not cling. Clinging was the mechanism that prolonged disruption. This also changes how you experience meaning. Meaning no longer needs to be extracted. It is not hidden. It is not layered beneath events waiting to be decoded. Meaning is simply the accuracy of response. When response fits, meaning is present without interpretation. When response does not fit, adjustment occurs without self-criticism. You may realize that much of your earlier search was for reassurance that you were aligned. Alignment is now felt directly, not inferred. It does not depend on mood or circumstance. It persists through variation. This persistence is not rigidity. It is resilience. Resilience does not resist change. It absorbs change without losing coherence. There can be moments when you recognize how rare this simplicity is in a world structured around stimulation and urgency. That recognition does not produce superiority or withdrawal. It produces discretion. You do not need to defend this simplicity or explain it. Explanation would reintroduce separation. What is stable does not require translation. You may also notice that your tolerance for noise has changed. Not external noise necessarily, but internal noise. When noise appears, it is obvious. It does not blend into the background. This makes it easier to not engage with it. Engagement would amplify it. Non-engagement allows it to dissipate on its own. This is not suppression. It is non-participation. As this continues, the sense of authority becomes unmistakable, though still quiet. Authority here is not dominance. It is the absence of doubt about where to stand. You are not asserting position. Position is already occupied. You are not claiming space. Space has already included you. Authority is felt as the end of internal debate. There is nothing to hold on to here. No insight to preserve. No state to maintain. Holding would create tension where none is needed. You are not responsible for continuity. Continuity is already present. Your only involvement is to not interfere with what is already functioning. If attention drifts into old habits, it returns without effort. There is no penalty for drifting. Penalty was part of the old system, designed to enforce vigilance. Vigilance is no longer required. The system is self-correcting. Self-correction does not need supervision. This is why there is no urgency to conclude, no sense of arriving at a final understanding. Finality would imply completion of a task. There is no task. There is only ongoing accuracy. Accuracy does not complete. It continues. Remain with this without naming it. Naming would create distance. Let it be unremarkable. Let it blend into ordinary moments. The more ordinary it feels, the more aligned it is. Extraordinary experiences require contrast. This does not. It is steady enough to disappear into daily life without losing itself. What remains now is not a conclusion. It is a stabilization. Not something you do, but something that continues when you stop doing. The system holds, the observer rests, and nothing needs to be fixed for this to remain true. There is no shift to notice now, no transition to mark. What is present does not signal itself as different from what came before. It simply continues without friction. The system is not arriving anywhere. It is remaining where it already is, without effort, without commentary. Remaining does not feel static, it feels sufficient. You may sense how little attention this requires. Awareness is not being held in place. It rests because there is nothing pulling it away. The absence of pull is not emptiness, it is balance. Balance does not announce itself. It is detected only when it is disturbed, and here it is not disturbed. Thought may still appear, but it does not organize experience. Emotion may still arise, but it does not define orientation. Sensation continues, but it does not demand interpretation. Everything functions without claiming authority. Authority is implicit. It is the quiet confidence of a system that no longer argues with itself. You are not maintaining this. Maintenance would imply vulnerability. What is present now is not fragile. It does not depend on conditions, posture, or understanding. It persists through distraction, through activity, through rest. When it seems to disappear, it has only been obscured, not lost. Obscuring does not alter what remains underneath. Notice how stillness no longer feels like something you enter. It is simply the background against which movement occurs. Movement does not threaten it. Sound does not break it. Activity does not displace it. Stillness is not the absence of motion. It is the absence of resistance to motion. There is no instruction embedded here. Nothing you need to remember. Nothing you need to apply. Application would imply this was a tool. It is not a tool. It is a condition. Conditions are not used. They are recognized. Recognition does not require effort. It happens whenever interference pauses. You may realize that even recognition is optional now. Whether this is noticed or not does not affect its presence. Awareness can drift into ordinary concerns, tasks, conversations, and this remains untouched beneath them. It does not compete for attention. It does not need to be returned to. It is already included. The system is no longer oriented toward correction. Correction was the response to perceived error. Error is no longer being detected because the signal is clear. When the signal is clear, response is immediate and proportional. Nothing accumulates. Nothing needs to be undone. You are not waiting for confirmation that this is real. Realness is no longer a question. Questions dissolve when their underlying tension dissolves. What remains does not need validation. Validation was always external. This is internal coherence, and coherence is self-evident. There is a quiet sense of completion here, but not as an ending. Completion as wholeness. Nothing is missing. Nothing is extra. The system is not optimized, it is aligned. Alignment does not seek improvement. Improvement was a strategy for managing instability. Instability is no longer present. If attention rests here, it does so lightly. If it moves elsewhere, it moves freely. There is no penalty, no loss. Freedom here is not choice. It is absence of constraint. Constraint was the constant narrowing around imagined problems. Without imagined problems, narrowing stops. This is not something you carry forward. Carrying implies effort and memory. This carries itself. It does not depend on you holding it in mind. It remains available, in the same way gravity remains available, without announcement, without demand. Nothing needs fixing here. That recognition is not a belief. It is a felt absence of tension. Authority does not need to assert itself. It is felt as the end of internal noise. The system rests because there is no reason for it not to. And in that resting, without emphasis, without conclusion, without instruction. What remains is simply what has always been stable beneath interruption.